Come on, Teams. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us at what month is this? February? at February's Limerick.net and Azure user group. It's good to see you all here tonight. And for anybody watching the recording afterwards, thank you very much for tuning in. Tonight, we're joined all the way from Toronto in Canada by Abdul. He's going to talk to us, as you can see on the screen, about the governance within the Cloud Adoption Framework. So I won't labor too much on the introduction. I'll let Abdul tell you a lot more about him than I have. So Abdul, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. So as Carl said, my name is Abdul, and I've been in the IT industry for more than 20 years. I've been working with Azure for the past 7-8 years, and I work for a Microsoft Azure expert MSP partner, which are really a handful in Canada. So really privileged to work for one of those. You know, one thing I would say is you can follow my blog if you haven't taken a look. And I've written a couple of blogs specifically on Azure Landing Zone and Cloud Adoption Framework. So today's topic is going to be governance, but if you want to get a sense of what Cloud Adoption Framework looks like or what Azure Landing Zone is, by all means, take a look at my blog post. And then also, I'm very active on social media, so connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. It's always nice to learn from other peeps and share knowledge. So before we get into the meat of the presentation about the governance, let's talk about why are people moving to the cloud, right? That's always a defining factor. So move to the cloud. So first thing is, what are the motivations for moving to the cloud? There are many different motivators, especially now. People are exiting their existing data centers. They want cost savings, cost optimization, scalability, reliability, high availability, those kind of things. And that is really what's making the cloud much more attractive to a lot of people. Because let's say, for example, if a company, even an enterprise customer, wants to do a DR environment, they're better off going into the cloud rather than building another data center, right? Physical data center of their own, because that's not going to be very cost effective. Or let's say if you have a project going on for 6 months, cloud is a perfect opportunity because that's more on the operational cost. So the cloud model really changes how companies are doing costing now, meaning in the traditional world, when you used to buy equipment, hardware, software, what have you, that was mainly done on a capital expenditure, which we call it as CapEx. You would basically buy it, and depending on the depreciation, you would do it for 5, 7, 3 years. Now everything in the cloud is operational level. So whatever you consume, you pay it. And actually, that's the one challenge I see customer really struggling with, is they don't still understand how the cost works and how to control cost. And I compare this with the utility. So even on our personal lives, the more electricity you use, the more the bill is going to be the same way, right? People don't, it's not like Netflix where you're paying a flat fee and then boom, you can consume all you want. It doesn't work that way. So I think that's still the biggest challenge I see with a lot of enterprise customers. I work with mainly enterprise customers and mid-market. I have worked with the SME market as well, but the biggest challenge there I see, especially that the customers still are struggling with cost optimization and how cloud is really working. So the next thing is value, right? Why are we moving to the cloud? What exactly is cloud providing us compared to on-prem? So agility. So the cloud, factors in the biggest agility. And I'll use the example of a couple of years ago, when the Sochi Olympics happened, people were coming and going to their website to watch the live environment, and then as the days went close by, the load on the website became much faster and faster, and that because of agility and because of the way cloud works, you can expand it accordingly, right? So that's the other thing. Cutting edge innovation, that's always better because there's no way you can invest that kind of money in your own data center. So for example, Microsoft spends $1 billion alone in security. So that's a huge amount of money, right? And that's why cloud is becoming much more secure compared to your on-prem environment. And then, there are other factors, compliancy and those factors. So there's definitely real value to move to the cloud. A couple of years ago, if you ask people, they were reluctant to move because they thought, hey, cloud wasn't secure enough, and I don't get to see my data, because people were really, reluctant of not knowing where their data was. They wanted to kind of have their own data, but as time has evolved, that is not an issue now. They're like, yeah, we're much more comfortable having our data in the cloud because we know it's secure, and it's going to be well taken care of. So before we get into the governance piece, I want to go through the concept of what Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework is. So the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, known as CAF, is really a collection of documentation, technical guidance, best practices, and tools that provides guidance for cloud adoption, mainly for the people who are jumping into the cloud. And this really started within Microsoft. So Microsoft Technology Services, MTS, they were using this framework for themselves when they were doing all the projects. And then a couple of years ago, Microsoft made this available for the wider community and made it public. So, and as you can see, there are three main facets, and you can see it's going around because it's an iterative process. It doesn't stop. One of the biggest misconceptions is that, okay, we've gone to the cloud, we remove workloads, our job is done. No, it doesn't stop there, because today you only have one workload. In 6 months or a year, you might have a handful of workloads, right? So it's really an iterative process, because achieving that balance, that process, and how that's going to play into your cloud journey. So the main three facets, I would say, is people, process, and technology. And then within that, you have documentations, you have tools, you have templates, and best practices. So that's what the cloud adoption framework really, in a nutshell, is trying to achieve. And then the cloud adoption framework has 6 phases, if you will. So the first phase is really defining the strategy, right? So the strategy of moving to the cloud. So you'll have a business case. Why do you really want to move to the cloud? There has to be a good business justification, like any business, would have. And your CFO or the your management people, finance people are going to be saying, okay, what's the ROI for us to move to the cloud? So there has to be a strategy, business plan. Say, okay, this is the reason, this is going to be the business case to move to the cloud. So that's your strategy. Second thing is going to be planning. Planning really is, create and align actionable adoption plan for the desired outcome. Meaning, how are you going to move to the cloud? So that's really the plan. The third one is going to be the ready state, where you're setting up the Azure environment, where the landing zone really comes into play, and setting up the foundation for Azure before you even start moving your workloads. So Azure landing zone, it's mainly a framework where you're setting up your identity management, your RBACs, your policies, your taggings, those kind of things. I've done multiple landing zone sessions if anybody's interested. So you're happy to take a look at my recordings for the landing zone session. So that's the ready state. Then the adopt state is twofold. Either you can do migration or you can do innovate. So migration is when you're moving to the cloud, you can do lift and shift, right? Taking your environment as is and moving into Azure. That's the easiest way of doing it. There are multiple ways of doing it, right? Like you can move your Hyper-V environment, you can move your VMware environment as is. That's the easiest way. The other one is innovate. So with innovate, what you have to do is sometimes your applications might not be up to par for Azure. So you have to rehost, refactor, right? You kind of have to modernize your application. So that's where the innovate piece comes in for the adopt phase of the cloud adoption framework. And then coming up to govern. So govern is really the governance piece, right? Like if you have your on-prem environment, you have governance set up. Governance in the cloud is absolutely important. And lastly, the manage piece. Obviously, how are you going to manage your environment from an operational standpoint? So for example, how are the VMs, the virtual machines, going to be patched? Who's going to be taking care of the virtual machines? How are the backups going to be taken care of? Those are things. One thing I want to point out is, of all of these stages, and I feel like that govern is the least taught or given attention. Because it's easy to not do it or forget, right? Like defining strategy, you have to have a strategy before you're moving in to the cloud. You have to have a plan. Without a plan, you won't move to the cloud or even a project, right? The project won't start. If you don't have a Azure environment ready, you're not going to basically go into Azure. Adopt, you have to have a strategy. Okay, if it's going to be a lift and shift, are you going to be redoing your application, or is it going to be modernization? And then from an operational standpoint, manage has to be there, but govern, people like, oh yeah, we'll come back to it, right? Like, yeah, pretty much people forget about governance, and that really gets them, because if you are not putting guardrails up front, then that's going to be an issue, and we'll talk about that in the entire session. But to me, governance is the most important piece, because it starts from even before the strategy state, and then it goes after the managed state. Because from a governance standpoint, you need to have people who are going to be sponsors for the project. You need to have people who are going to say, okay, there has to be a RACI, like a diagram, right? So who's responsible? Who's going to be doing what? Who's accountable for what? And then even from a governance standpoint, the biggest challenge we've seen is skill set. If you're coming from an on-prem environment, you might not even have the skill set. So you need to define, okay, what kind of skill set do I need to go in the cloud? So for example, right now, DevOps jobs are pretty hot. Everybody's looking to move in that. That's one of the other things from a governance standpoint. When you're moving to the cloud, you need to know, okay, what kind of skill set do we have? Do we have the right skill set? If we are going to be automating a lot of things, do we need that skill set? Or, how much time is it going to take us if we don't automate? So those are things all part of governance. And I want to keep this as interactive as possible. And I won't be able to, I'm not able to look at the comments or questions, so feel free to unmute and ask questions.
Sure. If there's any questions come up, in the chat, I'll be sure to interrupt or put my hand up, and you can answer them first. Cheers, awesome. Abdul.
So let's now talk about governance. So before we jump into the Azure governance piece, like from an IT governance standpoint, what exactly is governance, right? So if you have an on-prem environment, you're gonna have a governance. So governance is really meeting strategic objects from a legal, regulatory, compliance, aspect, right? So the goal is to have a balance from risk aspect, from a protection customer data. So for example, I am in Canada. Okay, in Canada we have two Azure regions, Canada Central and Canada East. Now, if a customer has a compliance requirement that their data cannot be outside of Canada, then they have to be in both the regions. Now, if they're not abiding by the compliance and they start putting data in the US, then that's going to be a major issue, right? So governance really comes into play on those things. And then we can also take a look at like modernization, transformation, growth, and business returns. These are also key factors that play into governance, because you don't want to be rigid in your governance, right? So I like this slide where it's control and stability and really speed of results. So the best example I can think of is shadow IT. A couple of years ago, when IT was fairly new, IT was, IT, especially the security team of a company, would be like, we're going to lock everything down because outside world is not safe. And what people were doing is sending files via their external email, or they were creating like Dropbox or Box accounts and sharing their documents because IT had locked down everything. So there has to be a balance between how compliance is going to be there, how security is going to be there, and then how you're going to be basically move forward with the cloud services, because obviously cloud is moving fast. So speed, agility, innovation, cost, and security are all factors that have to be accounted for in governance to make sure that it's the right process for that. So now you might be asking, okay, why is governance important, right? So as I mentioned, one of the biggest factors about governance is full compliance. So you want to be compliant from a data sovereignty aspect. If you are, let's say, a highly regulated environment, you might have to abide by, but especially in North America, HIPAA, FERPA, SOC, and then over across the pond in Europe, GDPR is a big one. So those compliances do come up. And then from a governance aspect, think of these. When you define your governance, think of these basic questions. These are amazing questions because, as I mentioned, RACI is already there, but who is responsible for monitoring, supporting, and operations? As I mentioned, these things are overlooked. You would, from a cloud adoption framework, which we talked about, we would talk about monitoring and all this, but you have to define these things before you even start migrating your workloads in the cloud. What roles and responsibilities must be defined? Because when people move to the cloud, people don't know, because cloud is a very flat environment. And what I mean by that is, think from a traditional on-prem environment from an enterprise standpoint, you might, it might be very decentralized, meaning you might have a team just for networking. So they take care of firewall, switches, routers, what have you, right? There might be another team which only take care of your servers. So, physical servers, storage, SANs. So those are isolated teams. Whereas in cloud, when you come to the cloud, everything is pretty much flat. So when you are moving into the cloud, you're provisioning compute. So you're provisioning a virtual machine. You're going to be provisioning storage. So, your blob storage, different kind of storage, and then networking as well, right? You might be doing ExpressRoute, you might be doing site-to-site VPN, setting up, VNet. So cloud is very flat. So that's the thing that has to be defined upfront from a RACI standpoint, that who's going to be doing what and who's going to have the responsibility. Because what I've seen so far, even in the enterprise space, that cloud is becoming flat now, meaning it's not very decentralized. It's very centralized. So people who are managing cloud would do everything from start to scratch. Provisioning the environment, taking care of it on a day-to-day basis, backing up, patching, all those things, right? So cloud, that's why I said cloud is very flat. And then what organizational changes are needed? So as I mentioned, right, those things are going to be needed because your organizational structure is going to also change when you move to the cloud. And this is one of the other challenges I find with people when they're moving from on-prem to the cloud. They bring the same mindset as on-prem to the cloud. It doesn't work that way because cloud works differently. You need different skill sets. You need different approaches as well, right? So that's going to be a biggest challenge from a strategy standpoint, from an architecture standpoint, from a day-to-day management standpoint. So those things are going to be very different.
Okay, Abdul, just talking about organizational changes there, we have a couple of questions in the chat that seem to slot quite well into what you're talking about. Do you mind if I ask them?
Sure, absolutely, go ahead.
Certainly. So from Andy Hudson, both questions. Thank you, Andy. So first one is, what problems do you see with regards to ongoing maintenance, support, and new changes, so new laws and regulations to ensuring adherence to the cloud adoption framework? That's question one.
Yeah, so great question. So, it really depends from company to company. You have to change the structure of the company. So I'll give you an example. So I'm working with the enterprise customer. They're moving to the cloud now. They're starting to move. We already did their landing zone. So they're starting to move to the cloud. Today, they have a on-prem backup solution. Okay. What they want to do is still use that on-prem backup solution for Azure as well, which is going to be challenging. They don't want to use the native Azure backup. The reason they want to use it because they're already familiar with that software. They already have the licenses, and they're like, that's going to be a huge learning curve and cost for us. The challenge there is going to be RTO, RPO. Right off the bat. So depending on what kind of RTOs do you have to abide for your company? Because some companies, if you take, for example, Amazon, they cannot be down for a second because they're going to lose revenue. So those are the things you have to factor in. The other thing we saw in this example is because you're not using the Azure backup, the native Azure backup, anything going up, it doesn't have a cost, but anything going out is going to have a cost, right? So make sure you account for that cost as well. So that's going to be another cost for you, right? The other example we've also seen is people bringing their own external firewall, the NVA appliances. So they're like, yeah, we already have a third-party firewall like the Palo Altos or Fortinet or what have you. We do not want to use the Azure firewall, regardless if it's premium or standard. So that's another thing you have to look, right? So those are things, even from an operational standpoint, you might think, yeah, those are not going to be challenging, but at the end, it is going to cause a lot of challenges because you'll find out when you run into all these operational things. So yeah, you have to account them accordingly.
Okay. So still on the topic of organizational changes, what experience have you had trying to get stakeholder buy-in for adopting the cloud adoption framework?
Yeah.
Tell us about how you get the C-level and other areas of the business to buy into what needs to happen to get on board with the CAF.
Yeah, honestly, CAF is a topic by itself, in a session by itself. But because there's so many pieces to it, right? Because all those phases, you have to really start from the strategy stage and seeing, okay, putting a business plan. Why do you want to start moving to the cloud and have somebody? You have to have a sponsor to begin with, internal sponsor, right? Why do you want to move? Have a business justification to move to the cloud like you do for any business? or any endeavor you're going to start. So that's first off, but it's really a rational step moving along, and then you have to have a plan and showing those things. But I think that is really out of the scope of today's presentation.
Okay.
Like, as I want to start dabbling into it, I think we might run into time. But yeah, the short answer is, I think management buy-in has to be there. You have to have a local sponsor that is going to say, yep, I'm going to run with this project, and then looking at the CAF, how CAF works, and then go from there.
Okay, perfect. There is another question, but I'm going to let you get stuck back in. It might be better suited to later on. So.
Okay, perfect. And then looking at the cloud adoption framework governance benchmark tool. So you guys can visit this website, cafbaseline.com. So anybody who is want to go to the cloud, right? Basically what happens is this is really a great questionnaire. It's going to start asking you a lot of questions. You might have to actually sign in for this. So like from a Microsoft account. But yeah, this is a great questionnaire. It's going to basically ask you a bunch of questions, and then it's going to spitball and say, okay, where do you stand and what do you want to do from a governance standpoint? So this is the first step in the governance journey, I would say, before you anything about governance. So any questions so far?
There is a question around compliance stuff, but we'll ask it a bit later. So I don't want to slow you down too much.
Okay, that's fine. So now let's jump into the cloud adoption framework governance model. Okay. So the top model, let me do this actually. So the top model, actually, you have the business risk, policy and compliance, and the process. So this is really the corporate policy. You would have to define this as you define on-premise. This has to be defined for the cloud. Now, the discipline for the cloud governance, there are 5 of them: cloud management, security, resource consistency, identity baseline, and deployment acceleration. I can do a session on each of them because they go deep down into so much. And just to give you an idea, the cloud adoption framework, just the governance piece, the entire workshop is a entire day workshop because there's so much to it. What I'm doing today is just basically scratching the surface, if you will, really talking about the main concepts and how it is and what really it is. I'm not going into deep down defining, okay, how cost factors in, or even from an identity baseline. We're not going to talk about RBAC or MFA on those kind of things. We're really talking about a high level that giving you a baseline of saying, okay, what does governance model look like, and then what are the different facets of it. Right. So these are the main pillars. And cost management, we'll touch on cost management. Actually, we'll touch on all of them, but what I'm seeing is cost management coming again and again. And I'll make a note or give a good example is Troy Hunt. He's an Aussie, and recently he got hit with $11,000 for Azure consumption because from a cost management standpoint, he did not, have any budget alerts, or he did not have anything there. And even if you look at the blog post, which Carl should be putting it in the chat, reading through his blog post, he said, yeah, he didn't have any of those things there. So this actually is a great example where you say, okay, why you need governance specifically for cost management. So learning from others, and I've seen people even in the enterprise space, they run, they don't have governance So one of the other examples I'm seeing a lot is if you do not have governance, what happens is, people, what they're doing is they're going and starting to provision all sorts of stuff. And then at the end of the month, finance is kind of freaking out, or the purchaser is kind of freaking out because the consumption is way high. It's out of whack, it's out of budget, and they did not expect that. So cost management is really getting great attention. So now let's break these things down. So with the governance plan model, I guess, they're native Azure tools. They're also third-party tools, but they're absolutely amazing Azure tools. And if you look, like for example, Azure Blueprint, it actually crosses across the 5 pillars, right? I don't talk much about Azure Blueprint. I've talked about Azure Blueprint in my landing zone presentations because it is a great tool. The biggest challenge is it's still in GA, or it has not gone. Sorry, it has not gone into GA. It's been in public preview for more than 2 years now. Hopefully, Microsoft makes it GA-ish soon. But it's a great product because what you can do is, it's going to make your life easier. Because Azure Blueprint, it makes it a repeatable process, so you can deploy your resources again and again. So if you look here from a cost management, you have the Azure Blueprint, you have Azure Policy. Azure Policy is amazing. You have Azure Cost Management, where you can go in and check. And Azure Advisor is another amazing tool to use because it's going to tell you where you can do cost savings. So it's going to tell you, for example, where you can do RIs, reserve instances. It's going to tell you, okay, if you are over provisioned, because it's going and using its AI model, it's saying, yep, this VM is over provisioned. You can use a cheaper version of the VM or storage or whatnot. So all these things come into play. So, and they're part of governance. From a security baseline, Azure Policy is there. So right off the bat, there should be policies. I don't recommend you start enforcing policies. You should have them in audit mode, but you need to have policies. So for example, there should be a policy. So let's talk from a compliance standpoint, right? Like I said, okay, for my customers, they're in Canada. Their data has to be in Canada, right? Canada Central and Canada East. So from a compliancy standpoint, there should be a Azure policy where you can only provision resources in those 2 regions. Anything else should be denied. So that's where policy comes in, and that's obviously part of governance, right? So now you can start understanding why governance is very important from the get-go, because if you don't have those things in place, it's going to cause you a lot of issues in the long term. The other thing is, also you should standardize on the SKUs of the virtual machine. So you should say, okay, for example, we're only going to be limiting maybe a D series or F series, for provisioning of virtual machines. We're not going to be there. Obviously, there are exceptions. So, but nobody should be going and spinning up, N series vGPUs, virtual machines, which are going to be an arm and a leg. So that is part of compliance, because those things are already taken care of. And the other biggest thing is, when you are going into Azure, make sure that you have a governance body who is approving the Azure services. So as you might be aware, Azure has 300 services, right? Nobody should be allowed to provision all those 300 services. Why? Because you have to test those services. You have to basically make sure how are you going to manage, support, and operationalize those services. So it's a very lengthy process. I've seen customers, and even on the enterprise customers, they start with a handful of services, start testing them out, really hammering down testing them out, seeing, okay, there are no issues. And once they say, yep, this is all good and dandy, they start, approving those services. So those are the things, because some services might even break a lot of things. And then some services might not even be useful in the environment from a strategic aspect, right? So you have to think how that's going to apply. So yeah, and then identity baseline, again, Azure RBAC. From a governance standpoint, you need to, like you would do on an on-prem environment, start with least privilege, right? Nobody should have a owner or a contributor role to begin with, unless and until it's absolutely necessary, right? I've seen too many owner individual accounts. If you're even providing owners, that should be part of a group, right? The other good best thing to do is use manage identity accounts, right? Those are much more secure, especially for services like PaaS, Platform as a Service, right? So those are Microsoft managed services. Your managed identity is going to be perfect. So those are the things from a governance standpoint should be accounted for before you're even going into the environment. And from a resource consistency, again, Azure policy is going to come into play. Azure Monitor, you should have Azure Monitor to make sure you're monitoring the environment. And then you would obviously have a change tracking and update management. So these are different in a sense that it might work differently for each company, and it might work differently from on-prem. So, as they say, one size does not fit all. So you have to kind of tweak it to your environment and see, okay, how those changes are going to affect the environment, and then even the update management and automation. So from an automation standpoint, and then even from a deployment, right? So I'll touch on Azure Automation as well. For example, I'm seeing a lot of companies moving to third-party tools, for example, Terraform, because as you might be aware, a lot of companies are moving in a multi-public cloud environment. So they might have their workloads in more than one cloud, Azure, AWS, and GCP. So they're like, from an Azure automation standpoint, do we really go with Azure Biceps, or are we better off going to Terraform, right? So those are the things you have to also start thinking. Obviously, it does require a skill set as well, right? You might not have those skill set natively. And then even from an Azure DevOps, that's a totally different ballgame, because what are you, what are the skill set that you require? Because if you have a multi-cloud environment, then yeah, you might be doing other things like Jenkins and Puppets and Chef and all those things. So yeah, this can really spitball and become a larger discussion. So those are things that have to be ironed out, because if you, don't take these things in consideration, what I've seen is it really becomes a silo, because people can be like, yeah, this is my territory, or I'm really good at this and I want to do it this way. If you have governance, people are going to be like, yeah, this is the entire company policy, and it makes it easier for people to manage and even, adhere to those policies. So, Carl, any questions so far?
Okay, we have two more here. One, both from Wakar Ahmed. Apologies if I just butchered your name. I blame the Irish accent. So with cloud, we have or are moving to infrastructure as code. Do you see a future where governance and auditors would verify an organization's infrastructure as code and their policies for compliance, rather than going to ask for screenshots and stuff like that? Do you see? So I think, yeah, what they're asking there is, do you see a situation where the auditors would actually look look at this code to verify that they're deploying it in a compliant manner, or what do you think?
That's a good question. IAC can become very complicated, and going through the entire code might be challenging, but there are other ways from a compliance standpoint. I guess it depends what kind of compliance are you trying to achieve, right? There are multiple ways to verify. So I don't know. What I've seen so far is, IAC is the way to go. A lot of companies are moving in that direction, and it's not only helping from a compliancy, but it's actually helping from an automation standpoint. So I'm working with the enterprise customer, big financial customer. It's a bank, and what happened is there was a new developer. They came in, they start fiddling with, making changes, and they start making changes through the portal rather than, through Terraform code. Everything, and then the problem is when they were actually doing the pull request and going through it, it did not work. There were a lot of issues, and it did not properly, because they were not following the guidelines. Things were not coming, into play. So it did. So the challenge there, it was not really from a compliance standpoint, but from a governance standpoint, because they did not follow the right procedures. And they ran into a lot of issues. A lot of things broke just because of that, because they were using function apps and all that. And because it did not properly go through the code, things started to break. So I can also see from a compliance standpoint that in the future that is going to also come into play as well. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. There is another question around other SaaS products. Because this is Azure specific. It is an Azure specific talk, so I won't focus too much time on that question. Apologies, Waqar. We will be pushed for time tonight if I hold Abdul up too much longer with. But if there's time at the end, we'll ask your question, no problem. So carry on.
Okay, perfect. So moving along, with Azure. The next step is really, creating a governance MVP. So really, this is really putting a foundation of the Azure MVP. And as you can see, we've already talked about the different facets. So the identity strategy, network and encryption strategy, these things have to be placed. So from an identity strategy, for example, right? It's really going to define how the environment looks like. Is it a greenfield environment, meaning you're born in the cloud, you're just coming fresh, or are you coming from on-prem? If you're coming from on-prem, you bring those identity into the cloud. You probably do a sync up through Azure AD Connect, those kind of things, and then you have to take a look and see, okay, how those identities are going to play into the mix, right? So those. You have to define the strategy upfront. The biggest risk there is going to be your data. You have to protect the data. So from a discipline aspect, we have to start looking at the risk, right? The other aspect is resource management discipline. So update corporate policy, because now things have evolved. Things are evolving. You might have introduced new services. That requires new policies and guidelines. So that's going to also require, right? And that risk is going to be critical app risk. The other is cost management discipline. So as cost evolves, meaning you are bringing more and more workloads into Azure, your cost is going to go up. So how do you manage cost? Are you looking to optimize cost by buying RIs, reserved instances? Are you looking to optimize by saying, okay, downgrading your virtual machines or your plans? For example, web apps, you have different kind of plans. Is the premium really needed? Or maybe, for example, Azure Firewall, do you need all the Azure Firewall premium version? You might get away with the standard, right? Those are the things you have to start looking from the get-go. As you evolve, yes, you might need those features, but as I mentioned earlier, this is a constant, evolution. So you have to keep coming back and checking every time and making sure that these things are put into play, because otherwise you'll be like, oh, the cost, that's out of whack. How do we really manage the cost? So perfect example is I'm working with the enterprise customer now, like they haven't actually done anything regarding their cost. So what's happening is their VMs are all over the place. The cost is really astronomical, and they're like, okay, we need to really get a handle on our cost because we're really out of budget now. So that's another factor you have to play, and how that's going to basically affect your governance. So now let's take a look at example, and this is a great example, and the reason being is it basically splits into two. So from a standard enterprise and complex enterprise, and then what this really defines is if you, so what standard enterprise is standard, a large customer, but in one geographical location. So that's going to be a standard enterprise. A complex enterprise is going to be requires multi-geography. So, for example, if a customer wants to be in North America, then they might have regions in Canada and then US. That's going to be a complex environment. If a customer only wants to be in Canada, that's going to be a standard environment, right? So depending on your company or your customer, you have to define these things, and governance is definitely going to come into play. I know before starting the session with Alan, we were having a discussion about ExpressRoute, and I've had this discussion with a lot of my customers as well. That can become fairly expensive. So even from a governance standpoint, you have to figure out, okay, which SKU of the ExpressRoute you want to go with, right? That's, you might say, oh, but that's such a minute discussion. Absolutely it is, but it's going to break or make your budget too, right? So those are things you have to start talking about from a cost and governance aspect. Do you really need ExpressRoute? Can you get away with site-to-site VPN? Those kind of factors. So this, I'm not going to go through this entire chart, but actually this chart does a great job of explaining, why have a standard enterprise versus a complex enterprise, and what are the things that are really needed for it. So one of the other things I've come across with other environments is concerns of multi-force, multi-domain environment as well. In the enterprise space, what I've also seen is companies having multiple tenants, so just not one tenant. So they might have a Azure tenant for production. What they're doing is they're replicating the entire tenant into another tenant just for testing, because they don't want to do any testing in the production environment. So they're replicating that environment. That doubles their cost too. And now they have to have governance in both the environment, because although the test tenant is a test tenant, but it still has cost, it still has data, it still has to abide by the compliancy, those factors play into things. So yeah, it can get complicated. So those are the things that really come into play. Carl, any questions so far?
No further questions at this point. Keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going. So now let's talk about the cloud governance teams and functions, right? So as I mentioned, you really need to have a cloud team that is going to make sure that the cloud adoption risk and risk tolerant are properly evaluated and managed. Because as I mentioned, governance is all about risk, risk about compliancy, legal risk, right? So you have to identify, there has to be a team, and in the enterprise world, I've seen that there are governing bodies that meet on a monthly basis. Maybe if it's really new, they might even meet bi-weekly, but monthly basis, where they will say, yeah, these are the governing issues we need to tackle, and then get approval on those. And then from a governance cloud team, these are the things that we already talked about. So you have to really look at the implementing the governance MVP approach, which we talked about earlier from multiple slides. And then, so here's what the governance team is going to look like, and it's going to do. So it's going to review the company strategic plan. It's going to basically look at the cloud adoption plan, and then it's going to look at the operational management plan as well, because these are all things that have to be defined. And as I said, these things have to be defined before you even start going into the cloud. And then from a cost management, these are some of the things that should be established right off the bat. I've already kind of talked about allowing VM SKUs. Same thing, storage SKUs should be there, networking SKUs and database SKUs. This is going to basically make sure that you are compliant, you're not over cost, right? So those are things that have to be from a cost aspect. Now, from a security baseline, there are different measurements you can take a look from a networking standpoint. If you're coming from on-prem, you'll probably need a site-to-site VPN. Encryption is critical, so everything should be encrypted. As you know, let's say if you have an IaaS environment, your VMs are not encrypted by default, so you have to encrypt them. So those security baselines have to be met, and those things have to be really accounted for from a governance standpoint. From a resource consistency, you have to start assigning, and the biggest thing I've seen is naming conventions. People do not give enough preference to naming conventions. The biggest challenge is you cannot change names after you have named a resource, right? So you can rename a subscription, but you cannot rename a resource or resource group. The biggest challenge is going to be if you are going to have a new convention, and I'm working with a customer now, they want to redo their naming convention. What's happening now is we have to create new resources, new resource groups, and then move everything over. So it's such a painful process. There's no easy way of doing it. So right off the bat, have a very good naming convention. It's going to save a lot of time and effort. The other thing is tagging. Tagging is absolutely important, because let's say if you're doing a chargeback for an internal department, if you do not have tagging, that's going to be the biggest challenge for you. So you really want to have tagging, which is going to help you, keep track of all your resources. From a identity baseline, I've already kind of mentioned RBAC. So role-based access control, RBAC is definitely very helpful. You can assign RBAC, depending on management groups, subscriptions, resource groups. So depending on where you want to do it, and basically assign RBACs and make sure that you properly assign those. And then other is RACI as well. I've kind of mentioned RACI multiple times, because what I'm seeing from a governance standpoint, people do not have enough accountability, or they're not responsible, and people are pointing fingers because they're like, oh, looking at the open firewall is the security team's responsibility. No, it's the networking guy's responsibility, or it's somebody else, right? So those things have to be perfectly defined, because as I mentioned, cloud is flat, and things can get out of hand very quickly if those things are not defined beforehand. Then deployment acceleration, these are best practices for DevOps practices. So, automation comes into play, and depending on what you want to do, how are you using Azure DevOps? internal tools like pipelines and stuff, or are you going to be using other tools? So that really depends, but these are the main guidelines of deployment acceleration. So now let's jump into some sample policies for all of these. So the first one is cost management, and I've already kind of alluded to some of the examples, but some of the examples are, modify cost tagging, because if you don't have tagging, then that's going to be a challenge when you're doing internal chargebacks. You want to have allowed Azure VM SKUs, because then if you do not have these, then anybody can spin up VMs, and the finance people are not going to like it. Allow Azure region for resources and resource growth. So that's another cost management, and that's controlled by Azure policy. You need to that one, I would say, enforce it. I don't recommend enforcing everything, but I think that the Azure SKUs and Azure region, I can foresee this happening a lot. So I would say enforce that policy. It's very important. From a security baseline, again, this is a great list to follow. All protected data must be encrypted at rest, which we already do on-prem environment, right? So these are the things we should be doing. No public-facing website backed by IS should be exposed to internet without DDoS, which is becoming pretty standard now. The other example I would say is I've seen, so the customer working with now, they're like, oh, we have web apps right now, but we do not want to use a WAF, web application firewall. So that was an interesting conversation to have with that customer, because I'm like, why would you want to expose your web applications to the internet? And they're like, oh yeah, but the thing is, all the data or all the traffic for us is going to go through our internal firewall and go out through R. I'm like, no, that's like that it's going to cause a lot of latency. Exactly, a lot of latency, a lot of issues. You're going to have a lot of firewall rules, a lot of port openings and back and forth. So that's a no-no. So that was a lot of convincing to do. So you're going to run into challenges when people are bringing their on-prem expertise and applying into cloud. Yeah, that is going to be another challenge. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, we find and we've talked about this in a couple of sessions, that moving to the cloud requires a change in thinking. Like you suggested earlier about the change in organizational structure and how you tackle things, but there's a change in thinking away from the slow and steady to a more agile, a more dynamic way of thinking with the public cloud. And that covers everything from how you manage your resources to how you're talking about cost, OPEX and versus CAPEX and all the rest of it. It just requires a complete shift in thinking. And getting the right partner on board for that sort of stuff will ease that journey for you. Sorry to cut across you, Abdul.
No. That's a great point, actually. Yeah, exactly. And then from a resource consistency, right? These, do you have the right tooling? Do you have the right governance for backup? So, as I mentioned in my backup example for the third party, is if you're not using the Azure backup tool, you make sure that when you have an incident, you are meeting your RTOs and RPOs, because at that point, it's going to be critical to meet those things. So, and then if you are a service provider, you want to make sure you meet the SLAs. Otherwise, some companies have fines or whatnot, and if you don't meet SLAs, right? So those things really have to be ironed out before before you're moving to the cloud, and that actually is part of the governance piece. So logging is another one. I see people, saying, okay, yeah, we're not going to turn logging on. That's fine. Azure Monitor is not important to us. Those things have to be done, because as the environment grows, you're going to have challenges. We ran into an issue where there were issues with VMs throttling and they did not know where the slowness was. They didn't have any Azure Monitor, so we had to install Azure Monitor based on that tool. Basically, it provided dependencies, and the dependencies pinpointed where the latency and the issues were, right? So you have to have these tools in place from the get-go. Again, based on the experience, governance, again, is becoming more prevalent. And then from a identity baseline, having your RBACs, your make sure that least privilege access model should be there. Microsoft is becoming big now on zero trust. So I'm not sure if you guys are very familiar, but Microsoft has zero trust for everything now, for networking, for identity management, those kind of things, right? And then, so from an identity standpoint, that should be part of governance as well. And then part of that is, everybody should have a MFA enabled. You should have PIM, privilege identity management. The other things, conditional access should be there. So those are also part of governance, because from from the technical people, they won't know what, they know what to implement, but I think governance really puts a foundation of what is needed to fulfill from a compliance standpoint and from a security standpoint, right? And the other thing I also want to mention is when you are building the compliancy team, it should be all inclusive, right? So it should be inclusive from a auditor's aspect, from a compliancy aspect, from the security team, from the on-prem team, from the IT internal team. You might even have finance sit on that team, because compliancy touches so many different facets that it's just not only about security anymore. And then lastly, deployment acceleration. So this one becomes really tricky because it really depends on how the company is going to be deploying. So for example, in my company, we're becoming a heavily Terraform shop. Everything is done through automation through Terraform IAC, because we are a partner with multiple cloud, and it makes much more sense. So really, you have to start thinking from that aspect and say, okay, how do we automate it? What templates are we using? Are these templates approved by the board or not? Because some of the templates that you might be used might not be properly baked, so you might have issues going forward. So those are things that have to be accounted for. And lastly, these are the resources I've kind of talked about. If you want to basically, jot down these links, the cloud adoption framework. And as I mentioned, cloud adoption framework is such a big topic that each phase I can do work, like each phase is a workshop by itself, and those workshops can be multiple days. And that pretty much sums it up. Hopefully this was helpful to you guys and informative. And Carl, do we have any questions?
I'm just scanning through the chat. Alan, if you want to come off your mic, you had one about the cloud team that Abdul referred to, but I think he may have answered it for you.
Well, he touched on it a little bit. I was just thinking, you mentioned a cloud team. Were you implying that the cloud team covers all of the roles in one team, or were you just specifically referring to governance?
So governance in particular, and plus depending on the environment as well, right? It really depends how the cloud team is going to be broken down. Is it decentralized or is it centralized? Meaning, I've seen customers where they're only providing access to the cloud team based on a line of business application. So they're only providing X team for that line of business up to the management group level, right? Anything under, they have access. They're not even looking, seeing the root level. So it really depends how the organization is laid out and their role in the organization. Now, if there's a cloud lead. Yes, absolutely. That person should sit on the cloud governance committee because his or her responsibility is going to be looking at the overall cloud.
Does that answer your question? Okay,
Yeah.
Perfect. Abdul, let me scan through the chat if you have a moment, just to see if there's other questions.
Abdul, the other one I had was, are the slides available anyway?
Sure. I'll be happy to send out the slides. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll post it. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll post it on my blog post, and you guys can download it from there.
Okay. Cool. Many thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so there was the other question that I skipped past from Waqar. So we were talking specifically about Azure, and that their query was how to go about this sort of compliance and governance with other SaaS products that an organization may use. Is there a way like to, I don't know, maybe if you want to come off mic or maybe elaborate on that, off mute, if you want to elaborate on that question a little bit. Do you want to talk about what other things you mean? Are you wanting to try and get a centralized view of governance across multiple products?
Hi, Carl. Yeah, this is Waqar. So yeah, you didn't butcher my name. It was pretty on spot.
Awesome, thank you.
And you are absolutely correct. That's the question that I have asked. Like, yes, with Azure, we could look at, from governance point of view, we can look at all the loggings, but they will only be at infrastructure level. I was thinking more about compliance and governance level at the applications that we will be using on top of them. So application would be, let's say, a GitHub application which we would have hosted on the top of our own Azure infrastructure. Maybe a Confluence instance, or maybe we might be using SaaS versions of these things. Is there like a Azure native way or a cloud native way to gather all the details from them automatically and get a view from a centralized position of governance and compliance and maybe even security? Thanks.
Not that I know of, but what I'm sharing right now, actually, this is an amazing tool, and this is provided by Microsoft employee. And actually, I've used this in the environment. So basically, what you can do is run this tool. It gives you a landscape of the customer environment from RBAC, from governance, from subscriptions, and like the entire list. I don't know if it shows you the demo. Let me see if I can do a demo. Output demo. No. So I'm not clicking the right link. But to answer your question, Waqar, unfortunately, no, there's not a tool, because sometimes governance, you have to go and start auditing a lot of things. So for example, when we're doing, checking, let's say security would have different facets. So you can say, okay, MFA is one. MFA from a admin standpoint, do all the owners, contributors, readers have MFA enabled? Do all the regular users have MFA enabled, right? So that sometimes becomes a manual process where you have to go and do it. Unfortunately, there's no one tool that I know of. And I can definitely find out from Microsoft if there's a tool.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So maybe there's a gap in the market there, Waqar, that you might want to fill. Business opportunity.
Exactly. That is a business opportunity right there. But yeah, this tool should help you guys if you want to give it a shot. And it's very easy. It's PowerShell based, so it's amazing. It pulls a lot of good data in the Excel file, and yeah, it's amazing.
Perfect. Okay, is there any other questions for Abdul? We are quite a bit over time tonight, but this is an interesting topic, so I was happy to let it run. If there's any other questions, pop them in the chat quickly. I'll give it a minute, or come off mute and ask them. Alan, if you're talking to us, we can't hear you.
Wasn't me.
Yeah, I hear somebody, but it's muffled.
Yeah, it was. I think it's someone near Alan. Okay, thank you very much, Abdul. That was a great session. I would certainly love to have you back again later in the year for LDNA if you want to come and give another talk to us. But I'll chat to you about that later. Thank you everybody for joining us again for February session of Limerick.net and Azure User Group. If you've seen the chat there, you'll notice that the March session is just about to be scheduled. It is former Microsoft employee and now Octopus Deploy employee, Sarah Lane, who will be coming to talk to us about a session called When Superpowers Combine, Azure and Octopus Deploy. So I'll be looking forward to that because I haven't really touched Octopus Deploy and I'm curious as to what all the fuss is about. So be sure to, it's this time next month. I'll schedule it on Meetup now, so be sure to tune in to that. If there's anything you want to ask Abdul, I'm sure he's available on the socials, on Twitter and LinkedIn. I have them in the Meetup page if you didn't get them earlier. But Abdul, thank you very much. That was a great session.